Bronson and the people around him seemed to be acolytes of Trump, to bellow out untruths and half-truths and to diminish and demean those around them.
Today on the East Anchorage Book Club podcast, a woman once described by the Anchorage Daily News as velvet and razor blades. Former Anchorage Assembly woman and former Anchorage School Board President Heather Flynn. I am your host, Andrew Gray. This interview was recorded at Ms. Flynn's dining room table, and there will be some grandfather clock chimes throughout. The word we have heard a lot of recently is unprecedented. And although in some cases, I think that word is definitely appropriate, in others, it's not. Heather dominated the political landscape of Anchorage from the mid-70s into the 90s. She will recount some moments in Anchorage history that definitely challenge the overuse of that word, unprecedented. And as you could hear in that opening clip, she comments on Mayor Dave Bronson and Anchorage politics today. Heather Flynn, welcome to the podcast. Okay, so when did you come to Alaska?
Came in the summer of 1967 when my then husband was between a second and third year in law school. That you're supposed to go do some work. And we always thought we'd go back to Oregon because we were both from Oregon, and just kind of came up on a lark. He came home one day with a Martindale Hubble under the arm and wrote 3 letters and got a couple of job offers and came up, and no grand plan. Came back then in 68.
Did you teach school? Was that your first job in Anchorage?
No, when I came up here, actually I interviewed for a job, and the principal who interviewed me I thought was really adult, so I did not teach the first year.
You were social studies?
Yep. And social studies for me is learn about the world, learn about people from all over the world, learn about cultures and religions, learn about that which is different than you, and learn to respect it and even love it. And if I have a passion for teaching, which, I didn't teach all that many years, but if I have a passion for learning, it is understanding of and respect for that which is outside your immediate zone, and learn to love it. Travel, read, listen. That's my passion.
Can you tell me about the forced resignation policy as maternity policy in Anchorage?
Yeah, it was. I always kind of laugh because it wasn't true just here. It was true in Massachusetts, where I also taught school. I guess they didn't think that children could understand where babies came from. I don't know. It was dumb. And maybe it was patronizing.
Well, what was the policy exactly?
The policy was at the end of your 4th month, you had to stop teaching because you were pregnant. And as far as I'm concerned, yeah, I'm pregnant. And Patrick, my beloved son, he was Exhibit A in that issue.
Were you pregnant when you challenged the...
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I went to the school district and said, I'm pregnant and I'm not going to quit. And, I said, I'm sure I've got all kinds of grounds to sue you. And I did. I mean, discrimination. It was sex discrimination is what it was. And it's certainly economic discrimination, too. And the school board looked at me and took it very seriously, and they changed the policy. And I taught right up to my due date.
That's so interesting. So I was kind of trying to infer from the news articles that I was looking at, and I thought maybe it was once you had the baby, there was no leave policy.
Oh, no, that was. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yes, you couldn't come back to school until the child was a year old. So now you're talking really economic discrimination as well. It deprived me of my living. And, even when I was back in Massachusetts, one time we were doing evaluations for getting raises, and they had kind of interesting stuff like that. And I was granted a smaller wage than a guy. And I said, why? And they said, well, because he's head of the household. And I said, what the hell do you think I am? I paid every bill. I supported my spouse. I was head of the household. But it was an attitudinal thing. That was
Because your husband was in law school.
He was in law school. And yes, I was paying all the bills.
Was that experience what spurred you to run for school board?
No, not necessarily. You asked me one of those questions, and I think I had taught school. I had dealt with a lot of teachers, of course. One of the things we did not have was very good. I was trying to think back and remember, why did I run? I ran because I really believe in public education. There was a lot of criticisms out there that I thought were unfair. That's where the subject of evaluation came up. And it was, we're going to evaluate teachers to do blah, 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 blah. And I said, yeah, and we're going to evaluate principals too. And everybody else. You're not going to just pick on one group. It's funny because once we instituted looking at principals, we had a significant number of quiet retirements because we had some principals that were just, they spent a lot of time in their offices and not doing very much to support teachers specifically and education in general. We also had a big deal over sex education, and good Lord, that was always one of those areas that, I don't know, maybe it's my own upbringing. I didn't get very much myself, and it's one of those things that I thought was important, and I thought that, yes, getting sex education is a good idea, but the fact of the matter is kids weren't getting it, and they were making some pretty bad decisions, and so I thought it was important that they understand the basics.
Was that something that you ran on? Did you run on the evaluations of principals? What was your platform when you ran in 75?
One of these days I'm going to have to go back, and I think I got some files somewhere, and look that up, because I know I had 3 goals. And after I had run for 2 terms, and I could have run for more, I had achieved my 3 goals, so I stopped. I'm sorry, you're going to force me to go back and look up some things. But, I think I got quite a bit of support from, for example, from the teachers union, because I was very much pro-teacher. And maybe I felt at the time that they were being demeaned. I'm not sure. I'll have to go back and look, like I said.
Were there a lot of other women on the school board?
There were women before me who were on the school board, yes. Carolyn Woolforth actually was just before me. Carol Larson was there. I think that Tay Thomas was there. Yeah, there were more women on the school board. That seemed to be an appropriate place for women because it was about children. I say that with a little tongue in cheek. But I will come to, and I'm sure this was another one of the reasons why I ran, and it goes forward throughout my political career. You can have all the greatest ideas in the world and be passionate and have your values. Your values are reflected in the budget. And one of the things that I knew and I became the expert on was budget and finance. I could tell you down to the penny not only what was in the budget, but what it funded, item by item, issue by issue. In fact, Tom Freeman, who was then I don't know what his title was, assistant superintendent for something, but he was the CFO. He was the finance man. And I can tell you, one time after about the 2nd or 3rd year I was on the board, we were finishing the budget, and Tom said, when my number agrees with Heather's number, I know we balance. So for all the fact that whatever you dealt with, whatever the issues were, the bottom line is what goes in that budget and what doesn't go in that budget. And that has been true throughout virtually everything I've done. Yes, on the school board, yes, on the assembly, but yes, in my nonprofit roles as well. I was always the administrator. In the nonprofit roles, my job was to raise the money and advocate the program and have enough in the budget so that I could hire people a whole lot smarter and better than I am to be the counselors, to be the advocates, to do the work in the organization. And it's because I raised the funds And I spent them very judiciously, that I was successful in those roles.
I'm going to do a little disclaimer here. We're going to keep rolling, but a lot of our listeners are not very familiar with Anchorage political history. So as we go through, when we name people, if you can identify them a little bit, just in case we've got listeners who moved here 3 years ago and don't know who the people are from the 80s, that would be helpful. I want to get back to the school board. So
my disclaimers are in there that a whole lot of the people I might mention may be dead. So.
Right. Like so many of the issues we're going to talk about today, we're talking about Anchorage, but when you watch the national news, you see that this is not just Anchorage.
Absolutely.
And with the school board, we saw this, the mask mandate. They did it first before the assembly with masking of kids. And then also, it hasn't come up so much here, but it has a little bit with mentioning of critical race theory and talking about race and racism in schools. It sounds like during your day on the school board, it was about sex education. That was more of like the controversial topic and the controversial issue that got people riled up. Is that accurate?
To a degree, although I think it is more of a national agenda today. It is louder, and frankly, it's uglier. But I will give you an example. People for Better Education was an organization that had a woman by the name of Marisol, now dead, a woman, Shirley English, obit in the newspaper just recently, 3 or 4 others. And they were very closely tied to what was the Anchorage Baptist Temple, and what was their group name? Anyway, they were a very conservative, very Republican organization, and still are today. Glenn Clary, that's the name. He's very big deal still in the Republican Party today, and they were very much a group trying to push a very conservative agenda in schools and so on and so forth. And here's one of the, I can say it's funny now, but at the time, talk about embarrassing. 3 times I've managed to end up in the New York Times. The Anchorage School Board, on a vote of 4-3, banned the inclusion of the American Heritage Dictionary in our schools. Yes.
Why?
Because they went through and they picked out either 14 or 19 words in the whole dictionary that they found objectionable.
Like curse words or?
I don't know.
So you voted no?
Of course I did. But it was 4-3. And here's the funny part about it. Like I said, it got known, I think, all over the country. And my beloved mother-in-law, a wonderful woman who lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and she heard about it there. She probably heard about it from me. She gave me a copy of the American Heritage Dictionary for Christmas that year. I still have it. I love it. Anyway, yeah, I mean, it's that kind of foolishness that was going on. And we did have a strong philosophical split on the board at the time.
I'll just say I went to a school board meeting recently, and getting into the meeting itself was pandemonium. Just the police that were lined up, the screaming, the signs. It was very calm when I entered the actual meeting, but just entering it was a circus. And I don't know if it's as common knowledge in Anchorage right now that what we see at the assembly was happening at the school board a few weeks before.
It doesn't surprise me. There is, I think, a very national, maybe to some degree international agenda out there that pushing hot button issues, whether it's critical race theory or cancel culture, whatever these verbiages are that are out there. I think it's appalling to see the behavior, and I hope that we have school board members who are sophisticated enough and educated enough about, I don't know how to put this. We have solid curriculum in the schools. We have very solid, thoughtful, well-educated teachers. And I hope that the school board members will not fall into the chasm that this noise and this agenda has created, and will continue to support the teachers in their efforts to educate rationally and reasonably and thoughtfully. This goes back to my own experience. You learn about other cultures, other religions, other ways, and you learn to respect it, embrace it. And I must say, our community today is so much more diverse than it was when I went on the school board in 1975. And we have to be able to reflect in our curriculum and in our delivery. The respect for that is a very big, diverse community. And of course, we can't ignore the fact that we've got a whole bunch more means of communicating today. And a whole bunch of the stuff, of course, that's on the internet is outrageous crap. I also don't believe that just because it's outrageous crap, it ought to be banned from discussion. In fact, some of the best discussions that my students, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids ever had, they had discussions about things that were controversial at the time. I had a student whose parents owned a trailer park here in town at the time and did not ever rent or allow to black people, and used phraseology that, frankly, I would consider very unacceptable today. But he had his opinion, and his opinion got heard by other students and got countered by other students. I didn't have to tell him I thought he was a racist jerk. He was. But those issues could be discussed and dealt with. And, the similarities between, say, Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And one of the words that was used in my classroom? Circumcision. Okay, why is that an issue, or is it an issue among Muslims, Jews, and Christians? And
The desert.
that's a real issue.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one could say, is that sex education? Well, yes, to some degree, but within a cultural context.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for reminding me that.
Well, you went from the school board to the assembly. There was a brief period in between.
Oh, yeah, there was.
And were you the first woman on the Anchorage Assembly?
Oh, no. As a matter of fact, when I went on the assembly, there was Jane Anbeck,
Mm-hmm.
Lydia Selcraig, now
Mm-hmm.
deceased, Carol Mazer, now deceased. It was my intention to run. We went from October to January, and I was going to run the following October. Although without support, well, there's some personal issues that went on there. But anyway, Joe Josephson got elected to the Senate, I think then, and so that left a spot. And I was intending to run, and actually it was kind of George's last name. It'll come to me. Anyway, and it was the idea that he was going to be appointed, but then he was going to support me in October. And, various things happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an unbelievable surprise, and after 3 or 4 votes, that I actually got appointed to the assembly in January of 1983. No, yeah, 83. I was 75 to 81. Is that right? 75 to 81 on the school, and then 83 to 93 on the assembly. So yes, there was a break in there. Tony Knowles was the mayor then, and I'd been active and supported Tony when he ran for mayor, and that would have been in the fall of 81. Tony was great. He came to me one day and he said, "If you think I know anything about education, look at my college transcript." Anyway, so I helped him, with some points with respect to education, because that's what I'd been involved in for the 6 years before that. So yes, there were women. But then in the election of 83, which would have been in October, it changed. Mm-hmm. Carol Mazer went off. We had a real tsunami at that point. John Wood beat Lydia Selcraig. Carol went off. That's when Larry Baker came on. And
Jane Onvik, did she stay on?
I'm trying to think if Jane had one more year. Maybe she didn't. I don't know. I'd have to go back. You have to go back and you look at that. And over time, I served with, I don't know, probably 20 different people, most of whom, I really liked. So I served with Tony for a while, and then, of course, Tom Fink came in, and it was different.
Former Lieutenant Governor Craig Campbell and former House Rep Larry Baker served on the Assembly with you. They both recently represented Mayor Bronson in homelessness negotiations with 3 Assembly members. What was your relationship like with Larry Baker?
Larry, I knew from clear back at the Anchorage School District. Larry came up here, or I think it's what initially brought him here, is he was head of food services for the Anchorage School District. And then he went from there with Joe Montgomery, who was then the superintendent, with support from Joe, to found the Burger Kings in town. He was the Burger King man in town. And then he ran for the Assembly, which would have been in '83, and he was there for 4 years or something, and then he ran for the legislature. But then after that sort of tsunami there were 11 people, and then I got, I think it was about, for 5 years, I was.
You were the only woman?
Yeah.
And what was that like?
I'll go back to my previous comments. I mean, there was a little teasing here and there, but for the most part, they were very respectful of me because, one, I was always prepared in meetings, and I knew budget and finance up one side and down the other. And there was not a subject that came before the Assembly that I had to plead some degree of ignorance. Well, that I had to plead total ignorance. I knew what was on the agenda. I thoroughly vetted every single issue. And I got the respect because I was always prepared, even if they didn't agree with me. And I mean, that was true locally, politically. People would say, I don't agree with what you did, but I respect you because you were prepared.
Did you feel pressure to represent women by being the only one on there for those 5 years?
Yes, to some degree, absolutely. In part because there were some issues that came up that had strong impact on women. Boy, if you want to get into some horror stories, because this goes back to when I was on the school board, the Michelle Lish incident. And quite by accident, somebody found out and started running some stories around about a lesbian who was teaching, and oh my God, and Michelle was teaching at Government Hill School, and she had to be removed from the school with police escort because the crazies came out. And
that was in the 70s?
Oh yeah, that was probably about 70, 78, 79, somewhere in there. And, I knew her. I didn't know her well. It was one of these funny things. What was the paper that Howard Weaver and they put out? It was sort of like the press in those days, kind of an alternative newspaper. Something got out that the two of them had a marriage ceremony, and of course this was before it was an allowable kind of thing. And I thought it was really funny because it was in the backyard of Marilyn and Lou Payne's house. And Marilyn was the Republican committee woman, big deal, but whatever. And her son, by the way, Mark, was one of my students when he was a 9th grader. Really smart kid. But anyway, there was that to protect her as a woman and protect her in a minority situation. And by the way, this is probably where I need to go back and talk to you about the Equal Rights Amendment.
Okay.
Before I went on the school board, I chaired the Equal Rights Commission in Anchorage here.
So before 1975.
And I was on that commission for I don't know how long. I was the chair, and I only resigned, after my election, but still as the chair, we were working on the Equal Rights Ordinance. And I can tell you, even internal to that committee, the issue was whether to include sexual orientation. We finally agreed, not completely, but we included it. So I took it to the Assembly. I think it was in January of 1976. And it was passed. And George Sullivan vetoed it. But I wrote that ordinance.
Was George Sullivan the
mayor?
Mayor.
George has never forgiven me. I got more votes than he did in 1975. Anyway, I'm sorry, George is dead now, and he was a nice guy and one hell of a politician. I mean, that guy was politically astute.
So was it a political reason that he vetoed it, or was it his own personal convictions?
I don't know if he was still around. You could ask him.
I mean,
I think it was both. One, he's very Catholic, and I think that was strongly the position of the Catholic Church at the time.
well, but the purpose of the Equal Rights Amendment was for equality for women. So, I mean,
No. This was talking about equality in Anchorage for not just, I mean, it's for jobs, it's for whatever.
right.
And I mean, you can go back and read what it was at the
Right,
time. There's
right.
quite a history. So, got vetoed by George. They did not have the votes to override it. And it lay dormant for a while and it came up again. And when I was on the assembly, I think it came up twice during my tenure.
Mm-hmm.
And it was never veto proof.
Mm.
And sometimes it just whatever. And then it finally came up again. I think there was something written about it recently. It finally came up again must be about 4 or 5 years ago. You know, Ethan was the mayor then. And they had sufficient votes. And my son, bless Patrick, he got together with Bill Evans. And Patrick would be considered a liberal, and Bill Evans was, but Patrick said Bill was a very reasonable and thoughtful person. And by that time,
I'm just going to identify. So Ethan Berkowitz and Patrick Flynn, your son, who was on the assembly.
Yes, thank you. I'll get that right. Patrick's my son, my only son, my favorite son. They had the votes to pass it, and it wasn't going to be vetoed, even though it did not pass unanimously. Patrick always said that Bill was, one, a gentleman, intelligent, rational, and the issue came down to whether to include trans, because that, the bathroom bill stuff was going on all over the country. I think if Patrick were to describe this, and I'd rather have him describe it than me, it came down to, if you don't include trans, you're still saying that you are free to discriminate period.
Mm-hmm.
And I convinced Bill of that, and it stayed in, and it's there. But man, I mean, that was the same kind of fight. People lined up there was something about this just recently. It must have been in the paper that I read it, because it was kind of a history of this. And people came in wearing their red T-shirts of being, don't want my kids in the same bathroom or locker room or, that kind of stuff. They bust them in from Wasilla. So it's sort of like it drew all the nuts, and once again, you had night after night after night of testimony. Nothing, I must say, nothing as bad as it has been recently. And I think I know a lot of people who've talked to me about it, who would not go to the assembly meetings, even though they were very much in favor of a mask mandate and wanted to support the assembly, but they were afraid to, physically afraid to go, because of the harassment and the fact that, geez, some of these people are armed. And, I had to go last Friday to get a blood draw because I had to have my annual overhaul. I'm checking in at the lab building. Have you had any fever, any cough, sore throat? Have you been exposed to anyone with COVID in the last 14 days? Are you carrying any weapons? I said, no, I'm not, but thank you for asking. And that's the first time I have ever, over the phone or anywhere else, at the airport, I've had all these questions, these COVID questions. Nobody's ever asked that. And I thought, wow, what does that say about our community, that we have to be worried about people going in for a blood test, that they're carrying guns? Ugh. And that's what prompted me to speak out and write a letter to the editor and be interviewed. What has our community come to, that we have such uncivilized behavior, that we have to be afraid of one another? That's embarrassing. That's not my community. I don't like that.
So since you brought it up, I want you to talk a little bit about, from June till now, what has happened in Anchorage with the new mayor coming in, talking about what the assembly passed 2 resolutions encouraging COVID mitigation prior to the ordinance. And in August and September. It's kind of like, they just kept kind of pushing it forward, and then went to the ordinance, which of course created all of the circus, so to speak. Can you just talk a little bit about what you've observed, and specifically the assembly itself? Do you feel like the assembly has made the right choices and has, handled this situation the way you would have done it?
I'm just an observer, and I'm a whole lot older. So I'm not sure that my opinions on this are in any way reflective of the rest of the community. But a couple of things have happened. One, the disease got a whole lot worse. And so that all by itself is a factor. I'll say this.
At this point, Ms. Flynn became emotional, discussing the recent loss of several friends to COVID-19. She asked that this section not be included.
I can go back on record without being too tearful, but part of it is the Delta variant is much worse. It's impacted people I know and love. Some have died. And I think the ignorance and disrespect shown by those who don't take it seriously is awful. Beyond that, I find that Bronson and the people around him seem to be acolytes of Trump, to bellow out untruths and half-truths and to diminish and demean those around them. And I guess one of the things that bothers me about that too is I know Larry Baker well, and I know Craig Campbell well, and I consider them both to be gentlemen. I mean, I think maybe Craig has stepped up politically in lots of ways and places, and maybe that has changed or hardened his views in some way. But I find it hurtful, personally hurtful, that Larry and Craig seem to be encouraging, by their very presence, encouraging this kind of very dreadful behavior. And like I said, I think our whole political dialogues have become so much more negative and so much more divisive and so much more hurtful. And yes, I think that's Trump. And I won't say it wasn't around before Trump, but good heavens, he product and sold it. I mean, he packaged it and sold it. And too many people are feel as though they have the absolute permission to behave in such a disrespectful way.
What's our way forward?
Listening carefully to one another, even when we don't agree. Having calm, respectful conversations. And I can honestly say, I'll be real personal about this, I haven't always been calm and respectful. I won't say that I have used ugly words to people in public places, but sitting in private, sometimes right here at my dining room table, I have referred to people as total idiots. It's hard not to.
Well, I would say that a lot of those people who stood in the assembly hall and waited for hours to testify against the mask ordinance felt that by the assembly resorting to the emergency ordinance to basically stop public testimony, that they were refusing to listen. I guess my question is if we're going to say, well, we need to listen to people that disagree with us, does that mean that we should have allowed that anti-mask ordinance testimony to go on indefinitely?
I think there has to be limitations on everything. If you know that people are just going to come back and say the same thing over and over and over again, there are probably ways that you can say, okay, everybody in favor, raise your hand, everybody against, raise your hand. And at a certain point, you have to put a stop to it. And I think going forward too, we also have to be respectful of the fact that this is a public health issue. And public health issue is different than when you're talking about whether or not you're going to spay cats. A public health issue, well, maybe that's public health too, now that you think of it. But I mean, because it's a public health issue, I think the Assembly did the right thing and said, enough already. Let me go back to one thing that you kind of asked me about, and about the composition of the assembly and its relationship with Bronson and so on and so forth. I'll tell you one other thing, and this is off the wall. I think that a lot of the Bronson people and a lot of his backing may have come from what they perceive as what they don't like about the composition of the assembly today. One, it's easy to say they're a bunch of liberals, and they aren't all, obviously. But there are 3 gay people there, and I think that is a target that many people, while they... It's just like when the trans things came out. There seems to be a mindset out there among some people that you have to have something to hate. You have to have something to fear. And when you draw to a target like that, I think, and it did come out a little bit. I mean, I wasn't listening to all of it. I simply couldn't listen to all of it. But it came out to some degree. And because, you finally have gay people on the assembly, maybe on the school board, maybe in the legislature, wherever, I think that draws out some certain groups of people to be protesters and to be vocal protesters.
Even if they don't say exactly what the core issue is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's there. I mean, you go talk to, I'll use the term red shirt, you go talk to a red shirt, and you'll hear some really ugly epithets come out about gay people. And primarily it comes from men, because this is only my experience. I think men are far more threatened by other gay men, and for that matter, gay women, than women are. I don't know why. Women have always been able to be close friends before without it being whatever. It's just my experience. I'm heading toward my 80s now, so I've got a lot of experience. Something I always tell people when I'm speaking to them, large groups, small groups. I have a very long resume, curriculum vitae, because I've had a lot of experiences. And you know what all those experiences have taught me? I've had vastly greater opportunities to be wrong.
Dick Cheney, former assembly member, former assembly chair, was interviewed last week by the Alaska Landmine. He stated that the possible addition of a 12th assembly seat is a bad idea because it means that when you have a 6-6, whatever the measure is going to fail. What are your thoughts? And we haven't really talked about this. You represented downtown.
Yep.
Can you explain the single seat and what it was supposed to do and what it ended up?
Yep. By the charter, there were 11 assembly members. And the way it divvied out, Eagle River was the single assembly. And when we reconfigured and looked at population, and that's what you're supposed to do, the one seat that got left out became me. And it became called, and it's my own phrase, it was the old maid seat. You got stuck with the old maid. You got the card. Mm-hmm. And it's been that way ever since.
So what year was that when it became downtown's single seat? Or about?
Oh, I don't know. 80.
Before you took it?
Oh, no. After. I was the old maid.
So were there 2 of you doing downtown and then it became yours?
Yeah, it would have been Jane and me.
Okay. So you and Jane were downtown.
Uh-huh.
And then, did Eagle River lobby to get the second seat, or?
It was population shift. I mean, truly. And then when you started looking where population was, and, John Wood, bless his heart, he and I didn't agree on a lot of things, but he was every bit as good with numbers as I was. And so we wangled and we could do this, and it came down to a vote of what the map is going to look like. And I was in the minority, and so I became the old maid. And it's been that way ever since. It's a very diverse area. By the way, it included Elmendorf, Government Hill, Fairview, Mountain View, downtown, and kind of got a little corner of Airport Heights part of the time, but mainly it just kind of went down Chester Creek. So, but because I had taught school and been on the school board, and school board is area-wide, I had a very broad understanding of the whole community, including Eagle River and Chugiak. So while I represented the downtown core, I certainly had a lot of knowledge of the issues that went on everywhere else. So anyway, that wasn't quite your question. What was your question?
Well, about the 12th seat.
Oh, well, the 12th seat. I understand why it was being promoted, because it is difficult for one person to cover all that area, and because downtown, the core, is really an important area that needs perhaps a greater voice. On the other hand, I was on the assembly, working another full-time job, raising 2 kids, and finishing my master's degree, all at the same time. So I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying that there probably is, and hopefully the mayor and the mayor's staff also should be a strong advocate for the core of the community, particularly since it's so very diverse, particularly since it has great needs.
We have a plan on this podcast to ask every interview subject for a book recommendation. Ms. Flynn took this question and went to a completely unexpected place.
Oh, particularly with 7th grade boys, when I would have students that were whatever, maybe not doing too good, and parents would come in, and I would have kids who didn't want to read, didn't read, sometimes couldn't read very well. And I used to say, your uniform reminds me of this. One guy, a sergeant, and his wife came in and, blah, 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 and how do we get him to read? And I said, leave the Playboy in the bathroom and let him go in there. And, don't worry about what he reads. Don't worry that it may be only the cartoons. Just let him read. And the guy later thanked me for that. That finally got that kid reading. Read Playboy when you're 12 years old. That's reading. It's great. And there's some really good stories. At least there used to be. I haven't seen a Playboy in, I'm sure, 50 years, but whatever.
Heather Flynn, this has been a wonderful interview. That is a great place for us to end it. I want to thank you so much for having East Anchorage Book Club here today. And great job. Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. We also host Zoom meetings that you are all invited to. Please visit eastanchoragebbookclub.com for more information. Special thanks to Van Sanders and Corey Coolidge for bringing this podcast to life. On the next episode in 2 weeks, we will be talking with 2 guests, Dr. Leslie Gonset and Dr. Robin Neinfeld. They will give report from the front lines of COVID and will also discuss their unpleasant experiences testifying before the Anchorage Assembly. Please tune in.